HIRA and HIPS.cesee book launch, which is already a fourth event in the series. My name is Tatiana Ostrovskaya. I'm postdoctoral researcher at the HIRA Institute of Historical Research East Central Europe. And I'm very glad that today we are presenting to you an exciting book which just published recently by Routledge Publishers. And the title is Interurban Knowledge Exchange in Southern and Eastern Europe, 1870-1950. The volume is edited by Esther Gartner, Heidi Heinkircher, and Oliver Hochaden. And we are very glad we have the authors, the publishers. They will speak to you shortly. And we also have two commentators, Jan Soman, who is the senior researcher at the Masaryk Institute and Archive of the Czech Academy of Sciences, and Professor Dr. Harald Stuhlinger, who is Professor of Architecture and City Construction at the Fachhochschule Nordwest Schweiz. So we have 5 minutes for each author to present, to talk a little bit about the book. And then we'll have commentaries for 10 to 15 minutes. And they will, then after that, we will open the floor to discussion. And we invite all of you to, when you have questions in the process of presentation, so you are very welcome to write them in chat. We will be looking in chat from time to time. So I'm excited to introduce Heidi Heinkircher, who is a head of the academic forum at the HIRA Institute for Historical Research in Central Eastern Europe, Central Europe. And she is one of the editors of this volume. Heidi?
Okay, so I'm going to start. Thank you. Yeah, good evening. Hello, everybody. I'm really happy that you all are joining us in our event. And as far as I see, there are a lot of colleagues joining us. So thank you for coming and for participating. About 7 years ago, my colleague Esther Gantner and me designed a summer school on urban space and knowledge exchange. When we started it, it was part of the precursor of HIRA, the Herder Institute Research Academy. It was the Leibniz Graduate School for the Knowledge of Transfer in East Central European contexts. Preparing the summer school, we got in touch with Oliver Hochadel. Then the team was set, a team for further great events. The team consisted of Esther and me, 2 urban historians, and a colleague from Barcelona working on the history of science. We found out that we were really interested in urban history by different but surprisingly complementary viewpoints and ideas how this our project on interurban knowledge exchange should go ahead. So it was really a complementary team, and we developed in an intensive exchange of ideas, which led to a lot of events and mainly to 2 conferences in Barcelona in 2016 and in Marburg in 2017. And these conferences were dedicated for the preparing of this book. Thanks to the Thyssen Foundation, we could then meet personally. We have to highlight this in Corona times. The idea for this book owes very much to Esther's vision of how to invigorate urban history and Eastern European history with new ideas and interdisciplinary alliances. So, editing this volume was a common enterprise, and for me, a great adventure. But I want to point out, Esther always was a really incentive-giving and prompting colleague. From today's standpoint, this book was an affair of her heart, so that we communicated regarding our introduction some days before she passed away in August 2019. Hence, dedicating this book to Esther's memory is for us the last way to show how thankful Oliver and me are for all her commitment and her ideas. Today, I do not want to retrace all our highs and lows during the conceptual and editing phases. But I want to thank all our authors for the commitment to our project, their patience, their ideas, and of course, their texts. Moreover, also on behalf of Oliver, I want to thank our home institutions, the Instituto Milan i Fontanals in Barcelona and the HIRA Institute in Marburg for supporting and giving us the freedom to let our ideas grow. And last but not least, we want to thank Routledge and the series editors Bert de Monk and Simon Gunn for the acceptance and putting it in the series of the advances in urban studies. Before I pass the baton to Oliver, I want to thank our organizers, Tatiana Astuskaya and Jan Surman. So, and of course, we want to thank our both commentators, that is Jan Surman and Harald Stühlinger. So, Oliver, it's up to you.
So, good evening, everybody. This is a great moment after a long gestation. Heidi just recounted all those years, 6, 7 years ago. This whole project started. Now in October, the book came out, and now in January, we are able to present it to a large and very international transurban audience. I'm sure Esther would have liked that very much. Let me pick up briefly where Heidi left off. Our trajectory. How did we come to this book? We should maybe mention that, for example, our central term at the very beginning of our discussions was periphery. Urban periphery, the so-called second cities, because Esther and Heidi kind of representing Eastern Europe and Budapest and Lemberg and other cities in Central Eastern Europe, and I, well, all of a sudden became a representative of Southern Europe, of Barcelona and other cities. So we were struggling with this concept, and with the departing point that so much has been written about kind of those first cities, the metropolises, and it's seemingly those other cities in this kind of belt around the center were just receiving ideas, cultural input, models, urban models from that center. That idea didn't quite square with us, and we went further and asked, well, we're not only interested in this relationship between the center and periphery, we're interested in the exchange between the so-called peripheries, right? So in a sense, it's interurban knowledge exchange in and between Southern and Eastern Europe. And I think that readers must decide what is the innovative feature of that book, but in our view, that is one of the new ideas that might also lead to kind of a new research agenda. What did the cities have to do with each other? That because we always see them just in the kind of this direction towards the center. And I do claim, and we as editors claim that, and thanks to our authors, hello authors, it's great to have quite a few of them in the audience. Thanks to their work, we know that there were actually a lot of relations, a lot of exchange, a lot of voyages going on between starting from Moscow all the way to Barcelona or Berdyansk, all the way to Warsaw. But my last point in our discussions, our starting concept, periphery, dissolved, right? We found it increasingly tedious, problematic, in need of explanation and justification. These cities are peripheral, the second cities. What does it actually mean? What are we talking about when we talk about periphery? And when we presented our project, colleagues were raising their eyebrows. Periphery, a bit of a derogative, looking down concept. And we eventually just threw it out of the window. And it felt like a great liberation. It kind of was our way into the topic, but then we had to discard it because we wanted to avoid to perpetuate kind of this hierarchical view of these supposedly second cities in the periphery. They were not peripheral. They were productive. They were creative and the historical actors and the exchanges that took place. They came up with new models. Well, often they adapted models and ideas and concepts they got from other cities, from other places. But I think that is one other message of our book. These adaptations are creative, productive. They lead on to new things. The specific context is important. The urban context of each of these cities that made them creative, adapting those ideas from outside to their own specific needs. And I think that really helps us to, say goodbye to this concept of periphery. It's only important, we claim, as a kind of an actors category, how they saw themselves. Yes, in that sense, it's still important. We don't want to claim that there were no hierarchies, that it was all the same, all flat. No, of course not. There were strong power relationships. We have to talk about hegemony, about economic power, political power, cultural influences. Sure, that doesn't go away by just throwing out periphery. But as historians, we have to take a step back and try and do justice to these cities and what they in many ways achieve, because that's what makes them really interesting. And I think that's where future research is or maybe should be heading for. That's for me. I don't intend to say much more in this book launch. I'm looking forward to the 2 commentaries and then to all the questions and comments from the audience. Thanks for being with us, and on to the commentators.
Yeah, thank you very much, Oliver. We heard about the history of the book, how it was conceived, and sometimes it's not less exciting than the book itself. And we also heard that it's a long history from the time when the initial idea came to its realization. And now I have my pleasure to give a floor to Professor Dr. Harald Stuhlinger, who will be talking about the book from the point of the scholar of architecture. You're very welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. As Tatiana already said or mentioned, I am an architectural and urban design historian, and for that matter, it's not a commentary out of the viewpoint of a historian, but rather from a point of view as an architectural and urban design historian. First of all, I would like to send my regards out to the editors and to the authors, because I know how it is to make a book, to produce a book, and then to actually have it in hands. And I am glad enough to have a printed copy in my hands, and congratulations to all of you. And I really mean that with from the bottom of my heart, because I know it's a lot of work. As Heidi already mentioned the history, and Oliver already introduced a little bit about the framework of this book, I would like to start in my commentary with a brief conception of the book and the ideas. I will pass on to some notions which I find very interesting, and I will conclude with a certain kind of outlooks, which I think might be quite interesting. As we conceive a book, there is also an intrinsic history within the book itself, meaning that there was a time of research, there was a time of production of the book. Now we have the printed book in hands, and actually it's not ending here. And there is also a future, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, or at least some thoughts, which I would like to share with you in my final thing. So one notion which was already mentioned was the transurban notion, and in that book, in the introduction, we'll find two aspects. One is the transurbanism and the nationalism, which are one of those frameworks in which the time period from 1870 until 1950 was regarded. And I think that the notion of transurban is highly useful in order for that, what Oliver already mentioned, that certain kind of aspects which have been monolithic in the history and in the narration, in the historiography, has to be overcome at some point of time. And I think that's very important, that we always have to keep that in mind if we deal with historic topics and concepts. So if you look at the title of the book, Interurban Knowledge Exchange in Southern and Eastern Europe, we see that there is a certain kind of bridge for a gap which has been there. Otherwise, the book wouldn't have been done. So it's like a puzzle stone for understanding better a period and a space or space and time in European history, which was quite influential. And that was done with case studies to see if, and that is also one of the notions which I found out as a concentration of the book as a best practice. I mean, if we think about best practices, we can also think about earlier possibilities or earlier examples of best practices. If we think of the 17th and 18th century as the model of Versailles, for instance, which has become a real fashion in European urban design history. So it's something, looking at best practices, it's not something which has been done at that period of time, but it has been something in urban history, urban design history for a very, very long time. I mean, and if I'm mentioning the 18th or 17th, 18th century, then it's just one example. Of course, it has been there for much longer. Before I come to my the bigger notions which I want to talk about, I would like to come to the topic of the Interurban Knowledge Exchange. I wrote down for me as a notion like the phenomenon of the flow of knowledge. If we talk about a network, the network itself might be the material disposition of something, but the network itself, the intrinsic quality of a network is that something has to flow between the nodes of the network. So I think it's quite important not to only think about the network, but also think about the content within the network, which is going to be, which is distributed or which is flowing, just to keep that in mind. If you look at the book as a reader, you're entering the book with a I think with a very good introduction. I think it leads very good into the topic, and it explains extremely well the ground on which the book and the idea of the book and the conception of the book is based. Then we have, of course, the 12 wonderful case studies. And at the end, we have the afterword of Wagener, to whom I will come back at the end again. So the two notions which I think are essential in the book, and even Oliver has downplayed it a little bit, is of course the notion of periphery, because it comes up nevertheless. It is within the theme of the authors. And the second one is this main notion of the network. And as I mentioned before, I can only say that as an architectural historian, if you look at the change of narration within, or the historiography of architectural history in the modern period, we have this so-called heroic historiography, and which is dissolving within the last let's say 2 decades, where also capillar studies have been done, where specific research has been executed in order to question, for instance, the history or the historiography of the modern architecture period. Yeah. So we had very heroic figures like Le Corbusier or Walter Gropius and so on, which really covered up other strands of history, of narration of the modern period, which were just overlaid, and that is, as I said, has been dissolved. And I think that also helps in understanding to talk about networks, and of course, periphery. We have, of course, on the one hand, heroic figures and heroic cities and important nodes in that network. And I think that in talking about this specific region or area which the book is talking about, and about the notion of periphery, it also really helps us not only to forget about those important heroic nodes, but to also see it as a different layer or a second layer or another part of this network. And for that matter, I really urge not to think of an either or, but of an as well as, because I think we cannot leave out those heroic notes when talking about periphery or second cities. So it's very important. And if you go into the case studies, if you read some of most of them, you will always see that there is an influence of a bigger node, of a more important center. I mean, talking about centers, that's also something quite interesting which came to my mind while reading the book, is for instance, when Tamara, you wrote about the case study of Zagreb, you said that people turned to the German example of city planning, and that really brought to my mind. So, if what really is a center? A center is not the capital of a country, or is not the capital. Yeah, it's not the capital of a country, but it is also an area or a region, it may be even a country, yeah, which generates or which produces a certain kind of knowledge which another region might need. So for that matter, I really like that case study of Zagreb to really rethink about the notion of center regarding to the notion of periphery. When you go through the book, one of the aspects which I think it might seem banal, but on the other hand, I think it was quite eye-opening, is the connection of history to actual agents. And when I talk about agents, it's an abstract notion, but nevertheless, I think as an agent, in many cases of the books, it was in many cases of the articles, it was a person which was interested, a person which was, of course, he or she were within the field of the discipline, but sometimes it was just heart-driven to travel, to be interested in other things, and so I think it really comes down to a person which was proposing and bringing forward all these findings and interest regarding another project. And I mean, if I look at this screen now, I'm also seeing people, individuals, which are interested in a certain kind of aspect and which want to propose and which want to bring forward science and urban knowledge transfer or knowledge transfer by such. One thing which I found also interesting, and that relates also to the agents, to the individual people which were influenced, which were part of this study, is the topic of serendipity and coincidence. It's something hard you can research upon, but it is also an aspect which might be quite interesting and interesting to think about. Koavagener wrote in his afterword something which was quite interesting, because he said something about that all those case studies lay in a very distant past. And I think his afterword was really very interesting, and it opened up the idea of center and periphery. I think it's a very interesting article to read. But I'm criticizing a bit this notion of a distant past, because if you think about it is about urban aspects. If you think about the longevity of urban infrastructure, of urban design layouts, of architectural objects, it has something rooted, of course, in a past, in a distant history, but nevertheless, we are still living within these objects. We are still using this urban infrastructure. So I think the history may be distant, but the products and the executed projects we are still living in, and it's quite a link between history and the present. I think all of the authors did a really, really interesting job, a very detailed job in going into archival material, in very detailed studies. And I'm thinking about how could the future look like if we think about the tendencies of digitization, can studies in that field be, can they advance in a much faster way? Can we link archival material from Lviv and Palermo or Krakow and Edinburgh? I don't know, but perhaps that might be an aspect which I think is quite interesting. In the case study of Barcelona and Bucharest by Lucilla, which I saw just before, it was an aspect in there which was about language. You had two proponents in those two countries, and they would speak, I mean, in Romania and in Spain and Catalonia, and they would speak French with each other. I think if we talk about the interurban knowledge exchange in Southern and Eastern Europe, I think language is a topic. It was not that addressed as often as I wished, but I think that is also something which could play part in further discussions on that matter. And a second thing which came to my mind is the role of media, because it's something which interests me a lot. The media of photography and film, which could have played a more vital role in the whole discussion, which I did not find that much. So I would like to conclude with one request, which I think might be interesting, because I think this all those findings, they really cry for a popularization of these things which are written in this book, and I would wish for I don't know, some kind of besides this publication, it might be an exhibition which might travel and which might help the international understanding within Europe, which I think, and that might be a very high goal to ask for, but I think what can we as scientists contribute to society? It's not something that we as a small circle do for each other, but I think we have to work for the society, for, as the title says, Europe, for Europe. And I think to understand the other better is through stories. And what you as authors have done is to tell stories, detailed stories about things which have been going on in Europe. And with that, I would like to conclude, and I hope we can go into an interesting discussion after Jan's input. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Stühlinger. I think your reflections show that the book is both exciting and timely. It was needed, and it will be needed also for a broader publicum. And you addressed a lot of questions, which I think also you asked some questions, addressed a lot of issues, which maybe also editors and of some of the presenting authors will be also would like to address in the further discussion. And now we are inviting Jan Suman, who is a historian of knowledge, a historian of science, and he will give his comments from his point of view, and we're very much looking forward to it.
Thank you, Tatiana, and of course, thank you, Heidi and Oliver, for this great book. So I'm here somehow representing the history of science. I will be misrepresenting it a bit, but I already found it very fascinating that history of architecture has a very similar trajectory as history of science. We also, as historians of science, we also have to fight against the heroic mythologies and heroic stories by devising new narratives. And exactly the last years were a very good laboratorium of such narratives, exactly against the heroic history. And one of these narratives is exactly history of urbanity and science, which is in history of science a field that developed, let's say, more or less 20 years ago, mostly concentrating on single cities. And this is exactly something that I wanted to add to the history of the encounter between Esther, Heidi, and Oliver, is that this encounter is from the disciplinary dynamics, a very unlikely encounter. This doesn't happen very often. It very rarely brings fruits. But if it does, as in this example, it is very fruitful. So, I mean, as Heidi said, the standpoints were different but complementary. And I found it fascinating while reading to see exactly how these two different standpoints from the point of view of history of Eastern Europe and urbanity of Eastern Europe, and from the point of view of history of science, urban science, and science in the city in the Southwestern Europe, how these both standpoints very productively competed or worked with each other, or created yet another puzzle, which is a very interesting one. And while thinking about exactly this kind of how these two narratives came together, I think one of the points that was not mentioned yet, and I think that is still crucial, is the science and technology in the European periphery, which was a research program going for a large number of years, I think like 15 years, mostly based Barcelona, Lisbon, in Southern Europe, in which also the question of urbanity and science was discussed very intensively. And I know that Oliver played an important role in this network, and also within this network, parts of the cooperation with Marburg was placed, or exactly at the very end of the network, which deconstructed itself more or less also because of the question of periphery. And I found still remnants of STEP in the book, but exactly it is clear that because this is a mixture of Southwestern and Central Eastern European history, the terminology which worked for STEP cannot work for Lemberg, for Lviv, for Berdyansk, and so on. And I found exactly in the introduction, one can see different layers and different research traditions first discussed and then more or less rejected and replaced by new ones, which I find it's the most fascinating result of the book, is exactly because we have two different but similar research traditions. They very fruitfully worked together, bringing very interesting questions and new narratives. And 2 points which I, from my point of view as historian of science of Central Eastern Europe, which I would like to highlight here, is first the question of modernity or modernities, be it entangled, be it multiple, because the articles and the question of sanitization of the city, modernization of the city played a very important role in the book, but it was approached from a different perspective. So modernity not as something as a flow which flows in one direction, even if it has like different branches of modernity, like variations of modernity, as Sebastian Conrad called it. But in several articles, I found this very important, how modernity was used as an argument to achieve very particularist aims. And this, I think, brings yet another very vital perspective on how to look at the modernity, how it is discussed and applied in not only in the emerging cities, but basically in like every discussions about modernity, so basically throughout the 19th, 20th century, or even 21st. So the first one is exactly this new perspective on modernity as an argument and not as a underlying category. And the second is, and Harald already mentioned, is the question of the networks slash interurban matrix, which I find very interesting and also very important because it helps us to localize the transnational history or international history. Let's don't go into details whether it's trans or international, but in any case, it helps us to see the flows of expertise, the flows of knowledge, and not try to localize it on a kind of ephemeral sphere, which we call transnational. It is simply we are dealing with very concrete contacts, with very concrete communications, flows of knowledge, and so on and so on. This flows of knowledge, this interurban matrix, has a hierarchy, and this I find was shown also in a number of articles very clearly that there is a hierarchy, but it's not a hierarchy which comes from imagined geography. It's a hierarchy which is expertise. So basically, the place which has expertise or the site which has expertise becomes the center of the interurban matrix, and it doesn't necessarily play a role whether this expertise is based in Berlin, is it based in Moscow, is it based in Odessa. It's simply the center. I mean, the site which has expertise becomes the center of the network. That's at least how I read the several articles, and I hope that authors of the articles will also agree with my interpretation. But in any case, by this, we have a new perspective on the networks and a new perspective on hierarchies and, let's say, geography of hierarchies in Central, Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, which is exactly a very concrete one and very nicely helps us to operationalize it and deconstruct like myths which are still haunting historiography. And maybe the last point, which I found very interesting, fascinating, and a point which I think also brings forwards new questions for the future, is how this expertise worked on the local level, where scholars, architects from competing nationalities in one spot cooperated, transgressing their conflicts, exactly because the expertise prevailed over national tensions. This is also, in a way, kind of continuation of this argument about expertise being more important than imagined hegemonies and with this, I had actually 3 questions. And the idea was that I didn't know how many authors would be here, so I prepared bigger questions which everyone can address. The first one, this is mostly question to editors, but not exclusively. It is the questions, what is for you the most interesting similarity which you found between Central Eastern European cities and cities in Southwestern Europe? Because you chose the cities or the cases with certain ideas in mind, and how did these ideas transgress? Is there something which you would exactly like to highlight, that there is a structural or ideological or cognitive similarity or difference where you thought that the similarity would be? And the second question is, I will maybe skip the second question. The question which maybe as the last question, because there is a lot of questions and not that much time which we have, is how do you see the future of the research program which you started and which the book is one of the results. It's not the I don't know whether it's a final result, but it's at least the third or fourth result of which I know of. And I wanted to know whether there's new there's also some conferences which are not yet presented in the book version, whether there is plans for it, and how you see the future of the research program, because I think that it's a very inspirational one, which, because of its interdisciplinarity and intergeographicality, I don't know whether the word exists, but I think it makes sense, but it's surprising geography, it brings very interesting new questions, which I think that should be analyzed further. And I wanted to ask whether you have plans to do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan. And I suggest we'll give a couple of minutes to the editors first to answer these questions briefly. And I also ask the presenting authors to maybe to write their names in chat, and we see who wants to respond as well. And I also would like to ask other participants to write their questions in chat. Also write their names if they would like to write to ask their questions personally. Thank you. Oliver or Heidi, who would be the first?
I don't know. Oliver, would you like to start?
Yes. So thank you very much, Harald and Jan. You both did a very good job of not only of reading and commenting your book, but kind of, I think, picking out interesting aspects, even shortcomings. Fine, good. needs to be mentioned, and because I mean, there's more work to be done. We left out aspects, obviously, for whatever reason, and that's what it's all about in the end, to come further and create more interurban knowledge. So maybe to start now with the two questions of Jan, the most interesting similarities between Eastern and Southern Europe. Well, maybe an obvious similarity is their similar situation, right? The term we banished, the periphery. Sometimes we can't get around it, and that maybe it's not so much a similarity, but it's the sheer fact that they did not live in separate worlds, right? There were actually, many layers, many networks, many media from journals, congresses, and journeys that connected them. And maybe for me, the most interesting point was when those, different actors, I very much subscribe to Harald's insistence of, we have to look at the structures and all of that, but actors are and remain important in history, and we have to find a historiographically sound way of including them properly, because without them there would be no history and no writing of history. Those actors should realize, oh God, we're in the kind of similar situations, similar problems. Be it, we have to reform our cities, we have to find a new sewage system, a new electricity grid, but we don't want to do it the way, or we can't do it the way they do it in London, Paris, or Berlin. We're in a similar situation, and whatever you want to call that, common interest, including even solidarity. There's that moment of recognition, which comes up in some of the articles in the book. I think is fascinating. And how do you see the future of the research program? Maybe be even more radical in the sense that when we talk about interurban networks, then we have to push it further. In this case of the book, and for pragmatic reasons, because of our expertise, the people we know, we focused on Southern and Eastern Europe. And I think for a book and for a starting point, that was okay. You have to be pragmatic when you launch such a project. But I think I mean, there's loads of research going on in history, in transurban history, to push that further, right? And obviously geographically further to include other European regions, maybe more to the north, and of course, obviously outside Europe. Well, I personally have dabbled a bit in trying to find, you know, these interurban exchanges between, well, Barcelona, particularly Barcelona and Buenos Aires, but more generally, you know, the Hispanic world and within the Hispanic world, Spain and Latin America. But there are other examples, and I think that's what we have to do to identify promising case studies that put this research program geographically further, because the urban modernization that takes place in 1900 is of course a global phenomenon, and there we may join forces with global historians, global urban historians, because we have a similar interest, and we can definitely learn from each other. So let's go beyond our geographical boundaries.
Thank you, and I'm going further on. As Oliver said, we have to produce a more global perspective, and this would be a task for us all. For us, you are working. There are a lot of colleagues working on urban history. Coming to the similarities, for me, it was quite surprisingly, but also interesting, that the perception of being perceived backward was in Southern European cities as the same as in East Central European cities. It was they didn't hide themselves. They used it, the perception of being perceived backward was for them a kind of catalyst, a kind of incentive, and tried to do their best and to prove that they're not backward. And this was, and the actors there, and Harald pointed to the agent, or pointed to the agent, and the agents for them, they became really ambitious to show that they're modern. Of course, and this is another similarity. The perception or the notion of what is modern, of course, was a bit different, but we find similarities from Berdyansk to Barcelona, from Warsaw to Milan. There were very similar activities on the one hand, but on the other hand, it was because of the rise of the national movements. They used this very common features and put them in, or tinted them. Let's say they tinted them with a national color. And this is a phenomenon we can observe all over the cities we analyzed in the book. So it's a lot of to do. We can give only some incentive to do further research, to pick up our ideas and work with them. Tatjana, wir hören dich nicht. We don't hear you.
Yeah, somehow, yeah, sorry about that. I have somehow a bad connection today. Yeah, so I just said thank you very much, and I don't see any authors which would like to say something. Anna, okay, Anna Mazanik, yeah, would like to comment. Okay, you're very welcome, Anna.
Yes, I just wanted also to join a little bit from the side of the authors. First of all, thank you very much to all the editors of this volume and for making this happen eventually, and for all the experiences that you kind of created for us as the authors, meetings and discussions. And it was, really productive to, I must honestly say, not only kind of motivating myself to write this text, but now I'm using the introduction and the volume itself in my own work, so it kind of pays back to the authors too. There were maybe 2 points that I wanted to mention also in relation to what the commentators said. So one thought is about the chronology. Harald Stöllinger mentioned that there was this urban exchange before. So why do we choose this period? Somewhere in the introduction there was this sentence that yes, of course, there was urban exchange before 1850, but in this second half of the 19th century, it became much more intensive. So one thought that came to my mind is the agency of the act, which, for instance, is rather explicit in the notion of transnational municipalism, right? So it is about the municipal government, the municipality, which is kind of a different type of exchange that Harald Stöllinger was talking about when we talk about Versailles and, nobility looking at upper or, interior palaces. So maybe there is something here in this agency for governments that we could reflect upon or kind of emphasize, because I wrote a case study on Moscow, so there it definitely was the case that you could not speak of municipalism before, but so it's just kind of a thought that I had when listening to commentaries. The second thought that I had is connected to backwardness, because when we hear this word backwardness, it immediately comes up with very negative connotation. It's kind of bad to be backward, but the more I read the chapters, but also listen to our discussion today, backwardness, it appears as such a creative thing. As soon as you realize that you are kind of backward, it's a motivating factor for you to move forward, to do something that you haven't been doing. So maybe we kind of, backwardness essentially is a result and maybe a trigger of comparative thinking, if for urban reformers, but for any other reformers as well. So my thought goes in the direction of maybe claiming backwardness and rethinking this backwardness, perceived backwardness, of course, it's not this objective category, as this kind of driver of change, which of course was not only in East Central Europe, Eastern Europe, or Southern Europe, but there are many examples all over the world. In the United States, there are many accounts of how American cities and reformers perceive themselves backward compared to London or Paris, or metropolitan ideals, these models like London, Paris, Berlin, they of course had their own moments of backwardness. So I think it's kind of can be a useful point to reflect upon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. And we have another question. We have a question now from Javier.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. So mainly I was thinking about this elimination of the center and the periphery part. But I was thinking, in that sense, if we talk about the globality of the city, if there are just some places where the knowledge is transferred. I mean, for example, just taking before the 19th century, if we go to the Renaissance, sometimes some places the merchants kind of brought some knowledge. It was just not an exchange of goods, but also exchange of knowledge, books, for example. And in that sense, I would like to know if there was kind of transfer, in the sense that there were the actors like the people who brought the goods, the merchants, and those places that the merchants were, or was certain places where there was a certain talk, or it was the entire city at all?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Who wants to answer?
Yeah, I can answer. There were a lot of chances to meet and to not the network. Of course, it weren't the merchants like before bringing something, but of course books were read. Harald once wrote something about Alpon's way to demonstrate how Paris was constructed. And we had a lot of exchange of knowledge in between the modern journals, now of course engineering journals. And I think one of the main meeting places were the exhibitions. Not only the world exhibitions, there were the regional exhibitions, but also something like the hygienic exhibition in Dresden and so on, the Städteausstellungen, which were quite popular and were visited and visited by experts, by local engineers. For example, I found in my case study on Lviv, there were a net and the local administration, not only the engineers, but all the whole administration sent deputies to the, for example, for the Dresden hygiene exhibition, that the deputies could meet other experts and could exchange, and then they wrote long essays about that, what they saw before. And so it was put, there were a lot of possibilities for exchange. And of course we have to say it is, and this is the time frame we choose, it is because it was an accelerated and a wider exchange because of the better mobility, ways to be mobile, to make this exchange. There was a possibility to go by train to something like that. And then you could, the way you could put to use no, another example. The local government sent also the engineers and some councillors, for example, to different cities in Germany to see how they solved the hygienic sanitary problems. And this was only possible because of trains and something like that. And in my case, it is really surprisingly that Vienna didn't play such an important role. Then it were mainly the German middle towns.
If I may add something in that case, already in the first half of the 19th century, we would have like congresses, which were quite important as actually marketplaces for exchanging the good knowledge. And I think that's something which has started already before. Because Heidi, you just mentioned Lviv as a case study, which was referring to German middle towns. If we think about sewage problems in Paris, where would Paris then go? Paris goes to London because London is the place to look at. So it's about this center problem. It's not a center periphery thing, but it's a center link.
Thank you. But this was there was this proposition from Harald which somehow was left unresponded, about this traveling exhibition on the basis of the book, which would allow to popularize the whole history of the towns and cities from Berdyansk to to the southeastern Europe. So maybe you could respond to this proposition. Maybe this kind of exhibition would be also possible in HIRA Institute.
I consider it as an idealistic utopian idea, but nevertheless, I think you have to think big.
Yeah.
I think Harald is absolutely right in encouraging us to, well, now you've done all that work, you've published a book, and that's it, or what? And that we have, of course, this obligation towards the general public to share our research results in an accessible, interesting, attractive way. And what is the best way to do that? Maybe a traveling exhibition. Yeah, that would be fun, because it actually takes up the topic of going from one node to the node to the next node of the network. Or obviously it could be an internet project as well. That would gather all these supposedly peripheral cities and try and visualize and show their connections, the actors going back and forth. I would like to encourage, because I don't know, 4, 5, or 6 of our authors are in the audience. Anna spoke, but don't feel obliged, but really feel free, the others, to respond, for example, to this suggestion of Harald, or the 2 questions that Jan asked at the end of his presentation about the similarities between Southern and Eastern Europe, which are the one interesting ones, or the future of this research program on interurban knowledge exchange. So please, out there, show your faces. Let us hear your voices.
If not, I think Jan has a question.
Yeah, in the meanwhile, yeah, Jan has a question.
I mean, I will double this question. I wrote down the question commodification of transregionality or transnationality, which can now go in 2 directions. First, exactly about the question of exhibition or internet project connected with with the book, which I think it's a great idea. And like researching for my comment today, I found internet presentation of Berlin as a science city. There is something in Vienna as a science city, but which is of course like very regionally bound and has something to do with local patriotism. And it would be great really to see something similar based exactly on the question of transregionality, transnationality, or interurban matrix. And I think that would be a very interesting perspective and a very challenging perspective, how to do it manually, how to make the exhibition as an exhibition, which would be then really network centered. So that will be the first issue of commodification. Please don't charge people for going there. So that was not what I meant with commodification. But what I meant for commodification is when you were speaking exactly about this intensification of interurban exchange in the 19th century, I was wondering whether there developed a group of people who actually try to make money on it by offering, communicating within the networks, or being knowledge brokers or something like this, who really then wanted to commodify this transregional network. And that was my question.
Who wants to answer?
They sold their knowledge by offering the engineering possibilities. There's engineering work. For example, the most important case is Lindley, a British man working mainly first on Hamburg, but then worked and his enterprise worked all over Europe. This is perhaps less well known than the Fellner and Helmer company, an architectural company, which did quite the same. It spread all over Europe and made money. So of course it's not only knowledge exchange, it is economic enterprise, let's say.
Yes, and one of the historical actors where we can study these knowledge exchanges within Europe and beyond, that's why it's such a great article, is of course Esther Gantner's article on Geza Maruti, who, for those who haven't read the book, you know, is from, well, he's from Hungary, or let's say his first center of action was Budapest, but then because of his, well, this is more, well, of his designs, he got commissioned to do things in Mexico City and in Detroit, and that's really a transnational and nearly a global story. And so Esther's article is, in a sense, already pointing towards this kind of more global research agenda that we should maybe embark on.
If I could add a very small, to make my question more precise, I was actually thinking whether there was, because like, I'm very aware that there is transnational actors, but the question is, I thought rather like a group of managers who say like, okay, I see now that you have problem, let's say in Lviv with sewers, we know something about Rio de Janeiro in sewers, and we can connect it, and this is how they would make money. So exactly not a group of actors, but of the practitioners, but a group of managers who want to make money out of this by connecting people. But I think that's, I mean, I don't know whether they exist then, but now they certainly do.
I think it's a quite modern kind of understanding. The engineers were, of course, managers too. Today it's more differentiated, but then it was an engineer was an entrepreneur and a manager at the same time.
Thank you. I think we don't have any further questions yet. So we actually planned 1 hour, and we are thinking we can go on a little bit longer for, okay, someone, Tamara has one. Okay, then we are listening to Tamara's question. Tamara?
I'm just thinking about this knowledge exchange, and recently looking through the periodicals of the first half of the 20th century, I find out that in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, there was a network of municipal of the different city municipalities, and it was kind of network gathering each year and discussing of different issues. So I'm just wondering if this was the case also in other countries, and after that this same concept remained in the socialist Yugoslavia, and it went further and beyond the borders by so-called idea of city friends, let's say. For instance, Zagreb was the friend of Bologna and some other cities too. So the municipalities also exchange knowledge of the different sorts of municipal problems within. So I'm just would like to ask, do you have any idea when this where these come from, as this knowledge exchange between local countries and beyond its borders too?
I think it was a search to find the best solution for the given local conditions, and there were actors which had in mind to which were ambitious to show the world that the given city, the local actors weren't backward at all. And this ambitiousness was a kind of a pushing factor to look beyond the borders. And as you wrote, for example, the Zagreb case is quite interesting, because Zagreb belonged at this time to the Hungarian part of the Habsburg Empire, but they looked at Vienna, and it was a conscious choice where they looked. And of course, it was in other cities we can observe similar phenomena, that the actors consciously searched for examples which could be adopted. It didn't, in their eyes, it didn't make any sense to look at, for example, Paris, to look at London, because the cities were too big. The cities, the metropolises, had quite different, they had similar problems, but because of their greatness, the problems, the layers of problems were really different from the needs of the smaller cities. And so it was a pragmatic approach to find cities with quite similar problems and look how they did it. And this is, and again, at the turn to 20th century, it is a kind of accelerated urban growth. So the needs to find a solution were, of course, more urgently than before. If we take the Renaissance cities or the Versailles, the example Howard Lewis, of course, Versailles was an example, and it was adopted all over Europe, but it was a quite noble idea how to build. But then it was in the 20th century in the cities. It was a need because of the conditions of living, the conditions of working, and this is a, to my mind, a difference. And this was the driving force why they looked over the borders. They couldn't find at cities quite near to them, couldn't find a solution.
No, I understand that. I just wanted to ask, maybe I didn't then make the right question. Actually, I wanted to ask if in some other countries there was the same concept within its borders, like in Germany, like in Austria, or some other countries, that different cities of these countries also get some annual events discussing different issues related to the city problems.
This was a traveling concept too.
I'm also interested in the role of architectural societies in this knowledge exchange, because if the journals, as you already told, were very popular media of knowledge exchange, and mostly these journals at first were produced by societies, what actually was the engineer societies' roles in knowledge exchange in some kind of democratic platform?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think that I'm sure there are so many issues to address also later on in further in follow-up research too.
Yeah, Clara has a comment. Clara Fistacka.
Yeah, also from my side, first of all, thank you very much, Oliver and Heidi, that you make this book. Was like for me really nice to receive it after long times, and thank you very much for all your support and for the very nice meetings. And I was asking myself the whole time if I should speak or not, because so many I mean, so many articles in this book are exactly about this interurban exchange that is maybe not really the focus of what I wrote about. But now in your last comment, Heidi, was for me interesting to think, because a lot of the authors here showed very good how exactly in this Eastern European and Southern European cities, there was like this searching for similar models, so for models that could work, no, and they are not the models of the big metropolis, but in my article where I focus on Polish press in Warsaw, surely there is also another exchange and positioning that is on the level of the popular press, where surely the models are Paris and London, and that's the level where Warsaw tried to position itself, to locate itself, and to confront itself. So I was thinking maybe if it's really possible to kind of think about two different, I don't know, two different levels of interurban matrix, in the sense of really network and of asymmetric network and way of positioning itself of this network. And the one is the how Jan also was saying, the topic of the modernity and the construction of the modernity of the city in a architectural but also discursive way. And in this network, for sure, kind of the references have in a certain way also to be the big metropolis. And then there is a kind of other network, more subcutaneous, less visible, that I think this book shows very good, that is the networks of how to do it, and how to do it. Then it's exactly about creating other kind of contacts and of so yeah, I don't know, it was a kind of comment now trying to position my contribution in this in the context of this book.
I think you're really right, Clara, that we could see different layers. Looking at Paris, looking at London was a kind of fancy, because there were fancy cities. And of course it was really, no, it's like us today. We look at really at the great buildings in not only in New York, in Dubai, and so on and so on the one hand. But if it's a middle town or a town of 100, 200 persons in population wouldn't dare to produce something like that. And it is more then they compare on a different level. I think we have to differentiate between that what is kind of fancy, modern, trendy on the one hand, but which isn't and wasn't at this time reachable for the cities we worked on. And then it was a pragmatic level. And this pragmatic level worked for the development of these cities.
I completely agree to that, what Clara said, and you, Heidi, as well, because it's also about the ideology behind. Because if you compare yourself with London or Paris in the point of Warsaw, then you just put yourself on the same level as this city. So it makes you, in your self-understanding, something different. It makes you, with all the notions Heidi just said, it makes you as modern as Paris, or as avant-garde as another city. So I think there is also this ideology behind, and it's not, as we know all of it, all of us, we know it. It's never about always rationality if it comes to things like urban redevelopment or the redefinition of a city after it had become an independent state and so on. So I think it's also these different levels which Clara talked about, which quite important.
Yeah, if I may briefly add something. Of course, we have London and Paris as these big magnets and kind of light towers that so many smaller cities in Europe and elsewhere look to. But and there is this cultural hegemony, etc., etc. Of course, there is. But still, particularly if we start going global, I think this whole center periphery model even dissolves more. And if we look at concrete cases, because you were talking about the popular press, right? And what was the model? Well, okay, well maybe the models of these journals were in London or Paris, but then I mean I know a little bit the case of Argentina, and when you look at the press there and like how few people lived in Argentina and how many newspapers they had, you will not believe it. Like you had 2 million people or so in the late 19th century and hundreds of newspapers, right? So this is staggering. If you look at, or if you ask, innovation and of specific cultural institutions or so. Well, for example, in the museum business, the big Paris Museum of Natural History was already frowned upon and the zoo as well in around 1900 as being backward, half decayed, not a model to follow anymore. And it turns out, that the first handbook on zookeeping and how to properly keep animals and what to do when they get sick and all of that was written in Calcutta, right? In India, part of the British Empire. Okay, but it came from India to Europe, and so I think the proof is still out there. We have these examples from Argentina or from India that kind of shake up this center periphery notion, and I think we have to do more research, and then the image we're getting will get more complex, more complicated, and more interesting.
May I repeat one aspect which I said in my introduction before, or in my commentary, Oliver? I think it's really about not an either or. I think it is really an as well as. I really don't want. I mean, I don't want you or us to be too ideological. So. I completely understand the interesting aspect about the non-hierarchical system, but I think we have to consider both at the same time.
Well said. Well said.
Thank you. It's a good point. I think we have to wrap up slowly. If speakers want to say something. Just a short comment, or once again thank each other.
No, I have to thank, and for me it is a kind of now the idea is going to go ahead with this topic and to go ahead with this project. I don't know, ahead into the direction of an exposition online or showing it in a real place, or going ahead in research. I think we have to discuss it, but I found it really inspiring to hear your looks on our book. And so I have to thank you all. Thank you. And for me, it is now important that you stay all healthy.
Jan, would you like to say something from the side of your project on the history of science on Central Europe?
I think from my point, it would be also a very big thank you to Heidi and Oliver. And I was very happy that we could host and co-organize this discussion. And I hope for further one, we can also discuss exhibitions in the future.
Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone, for taking part in this presentation. We're happy that you were with us. We were happy to present this book for you, and we also have other plans for future. So stay tuned and stay healthy. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.